quiet town of Bridgewater Falls, what started as just another act of harassment by the Iron Fist motorcycle gang quickly turned into the worst mistake they'd ever make. When they trashed the wheelchair of Vietnam veteran David Anderson outside Emma's family restaurant, they had no idea who they were really messing with. Because that act would bring home his son, a Navy SEAL with over 200 combat missions, and he was about to remind them what real strength looks like. But before we dive back into what went down, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story hits you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's video, you're not going to want to miss it. It all started on a foggy morning in Bridgewater Falls. David Anderson was already on his way down Cedar Street, maneuvering his wheelchair with calm precision. His hands, scarred by time and war, moved with the same discipline that once kept him alive deep in the jungles of Vietnam. At 68, he hadn't let go of his military habits. He arrived at Emma's family restaurant every morning at exactly 7 a.m. The bell above the door gave its usual friendly chime as he entered, the smell of fresh bread and coffee wrapping around him like a welcome home. Behind the counter, Emma Walsh looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that could outshine the morning sun. "Right on schedule, Mr. Anderson," she called, already reaching for his usual cup. "Sarah brought some fresh honey for your tea yesterday," she added. "Said her bees have been working overtime." David settled into his regular seat, the one with a clear view of both the front door and the street outside, a habit he'd never dropped. On the wall behind him hung two framed photos, one of a young David in uniform, the other of his son, Michael, fully geared up as a Navy SEAL. "How's our boy doing?" Emma asked, placing the tea and coffee in front of him. She had known Michael since he was a kid, long before he became one of America's elite warriors. "Still can't say much," David replied, voice low, steady. "Last letter came from somewhere in the Indian Ocean. You know how it is." The town started waking up around them. Locals came in, the usual crowd. Officer Connor McCarthy stopped by David's table like he always did. "Quiet night, Mr. Anderson," he said, then paused. Brad at the gas station said he saw some unfamiliar bikes riding through town. Probably nothing. David gave a slow nod. He didn't need to hear more. The look in McCarthy's eyes said enough. Everyone had been on edge. The Iron Fist gang had been moving into nearby counties. First it was just passing through. Then came the threats. Then the violence. Moments later, town council member and veteran advocate Elizabeth Beth Armstrong walked in, looking more rattled than usual. She headed straight for David's table. "They were at Miller's Hardware last night," she said quietly. "3 of them. Didn't do anything. Just looked around. Tom said they asked a lot of questions. Who owns what? What kind of businesses are here?" David stirred his tea, eyes narrowing. "Scouting," he said plainly. Years in combat had taught him to recognize a recon mission when he saw one. Suddenly, the low rumble of engines rolled through the street like a warning. They looked out the window just in time to see 3 motorcycles cruising slowly by, their riders scanning the diner. Each wore the same vest, a clenched fist wrapped in a chain, the Iron Fist insignia. "Just passing through," Officer McCarthy muttered, but no one believed that. The bikes circled the block, twice, then parked across the street. Emma's daughter Maria came by David's table, coffee pot in hand. Her eyes kept drifting to the gang outside. "More coffee, Mr. Anderson?" "Thanks, Maria," he said calmly, like he didn't have a care in the world. "How's nursing school coming along?" The bell above the door chimed again, but this time it wasn't a familiar face. Jake Lockjaw Martinez stepped in first, massive, unsmiling. Behind him were Steve Griffin Thompson and Carlos Savage Ramirez. The air in the room chilled like a storm cloud just rolled in. Lockjaw scanned the diner slowly. His eyes landed on David's wheelchair, then drifted up to the photos on the wall. A cruel smile crept across his face. "Well, well," he said, swaggering over to the table. "What do we have here? A real war hero. Right here in this quiet little town." David looked up at him, unflinching. Decades of combat had given him a kind of stillness most men couldn't fake. It only made the gang leader more irritated. The rest of the diner had gone silent. No one moved. People were afraid. and ashamed they were afraid. "You know what I like about towns like this?" Lockjaw said, picking up David's coffee cup and inspecting it. "Everyone knows their place. Everyone respects the natural order." He glanced down at the wheelchair. "The strong survive. The weak learn to pay for protection." When David finally spoke, his voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It had the same calm command that once led men through fire. "Son," he said evenly, "that chair wasn't offered to you." The room went so still you could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Lockjaw's face twisted into something darker, colder. Without breaking eye contact, he tilted David's coffee cup and let it spill onto the floor, every drop deliberate. "Looks like this town needs a little education in respect," he said low and slow. "Starting with you, old man." And with that, the gang turned and swaggered out. They had delivered their warning, loud and clear. But David didn't miss the details. Officer McCarthy's hand never left his holster. Beth Armstrong was already tapping frantically on her phone, and behind the counter, Emma gripped the handle of the baseball bat she kept hidden under the register. The war hadn't officially come to Bridgewater Falls, but the first shots had been fired. As David watched the motorcycles roar away, his thoughts drifted across the world to his son Michael, somewhere out in the vast Indian Ocean. He'd raised his boy to know that true strength isn't about fear or force, but also that some things are absolutely worth standing up for. What came next would test everything David believed about courage, community, and the real meaning of power. The Iron Fist gang thought they'd found a soft target, just an old vet in a wheelchair. They had no idea how wrong they were. 3 days later, the change was impossible to ignore. Miller's Hardware now had plywood where a window used to be, some late-night accident with a brick. The gas station's prices had mysteriously jumped overnight. Brad, the owner, blamed new delivery fees, but the fear in his voice said it all. Even Emma's regulars were staying home. Fear was settling in like mold. As David rolled down Cedar Street, he passed sidewalks where kids used to draw with chalk, now covered in crude gang symbols. Big fists scrawled in black, claiming the town one slab of concrete at a time. McCarthy's cruiser circled more often now, but they both knew 3 officers couldn't stop 20 armed bikers. "They hit Pete's pharmacy last night," came a voice beside him. Dr. Thomas Mitchell fell into step with David, concern etched into his face. He'd been the one to help David recover after Vietnam. The kind of doctor who knew both medicine and war wounds. "Smashed his delivery van," Thomas said grimly. "Told him next time it'd be his kneecaps if he didn't pay their so-called insurance fee." David watched a young mother yank her kids across the street to avoid 2 Iron Fist bikers loitering outside the cafe. "Pete's still giving out free meds to folks who can't pay," Thomas added. "Stubborn as ever. Reminds me of someone else I know." They reached Emma's together. "Beth called an emergency town council meeting tonight," Thomas said. "But it won't change much. Half of them are already whispering about making reasonable compromises." When the bell chimed as they entered, the usual warmth of Emma's diner had faded. Only 3 customers sat where there were usually 24. Emma smiled like always, but her eyes were ringed with exhaustion. "Maria called in sick today," she said quietly, placing their orders. "After what happened yesterday." David's fingers clenched the edge of his armrest. "What happened?" "2 of them followed her home from her nursing class, all the way from the bus stop, didn't say a word, just followed her." Thomas let out a sharp breath through his teeth. Classic psychological ops. They're probing, seeing who they can scare into silence, targeting weak spots. Just then, the rumble of a lone motorcycle interrupted them. Frank Warlock Wilson, the youngest Iron Fist member, stepped in, alone. He looked uneasy. His eyes darted around like he didn't want to be there. "Boss wants his money," he mumbled. "Says you've had enough time to think about his offer." He tried to sound tough, but his voice cracked. Emma squared her shoulders, her voice steady. "I don't pay protection money, not to you, not to anyone." Warlock shifted, awkward, like a kid who didn't belong in his own clothes. "Just pay," he said, "please." You don't want to see what happens when people don't. David's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Son, you still got time to walk another road. For a moment, something flickered in Warlock's expression. Recognition, maybe even hope, but fear took over. You don't get it, old man. Nobody says no to Lockjaw. Nobody. He left. Thomas glanced at David, who was already scanning the street through the window. I know that look, the doctor said. You're seeing patterns. David gave a slow nod. This isn't just a gang. They're moving like a unit, marking territory, targeting key locations. This is a military op, Lockjaw. He's trained. Some of them probably are. You can see it in how they move, how they plan. Emma quietly refilled their coffee, her hands trembling just enough to betray the fear. The bank's already cut off loans to the small shops, she said. Says it's too risky now. 3 stores on Main Street are talking about shutting down. And outside, more motorcycles were pulling in. Steve Griffin Thompson and Carlos Savage Ramirez dismounted, their leather vests proudly displaying new patches, trophies from other towns they'd already broken. They're not just shaking down businesses anymore, David murmured, watching from the window. They're dismantling the town's spirit. Make people feel powerless long enough, they'll accept anything. Thomas leaned in closer. Beth told me you've been making some calls. Reaching out to old contacts, he said carefully. Michael needs to know what's happening here. David didn't take his eyes off the gang members outside. Even if he knew, there's nothing he could do. His mission, it's critical. A crash from the kitchen cut the conversation short. David and Thomas turned to see Ray Shark Johnson and Victor Dragon Rodriguez helping themselves to food, stomping through the diner in muddy boots like they owned the place. Consider this a down payment on what you owe, Shark growled, stuffing bacon into his mouth. Boss says the rest due tomorrow, or else. He slid his finger across his throat and smirked. David moved forward in his wheelchair, but Thomas gripped his shoulder, stopping him. All they could do was watch. When the bikers finally swaggered out, leaving the kitchen ransacked, Emma stood motionless, tears pooling in her eyes. My husband built this place with his hands, she said softly. Ran it until the day he died. I won't let them take it. David gently placed his hand over hers. We won't let them. But as he wheeled himself home that evening, past boarded windows and fresh gang symbols sprayed over old chalk drawings, a quiet fear crept in. Was he making a promise he couldn't keep? The iron fist was closing its grip around Bridgewater Falls, and soon there might be nothing left to save. Inside his living room, surrounded by photos of his service and his son's SEAL team, David stared at a secure satellite phone on the table. He had sworn never to involve Michael, not while he was deployed, not while lives depended on him elsewhere, but watching his town crumble, watching his neighbors suffer. Some promises, David realized, were meant to be broken. Preparing this story took a lot of time and heart. If it's speaking to you, hit that subscribe button. It means more than you know. Now, back to the story. The next morning arrived heavy and gray, the skies mirroring the mood on the streets. David rolled past Miller's Hardware, where Tom Miller was painting over gang graffiti. Again. 3rd time this week. His hands trembled, but his jaw stayed clenched in sheer defiance. Then came the rumble, but this time it wasn't a few bikes. It was the full Iron Fist leadership, rolling in tight formation. Jake, Lockjaw, Martinez at the center, flanked by every lieutenant, engines snarling like wolves circling their prey. They surrounded David before he could reach Emma's. Told you about respect, old man, Lockjaw sneered, cracking his knuckles as he stepped off his bike. Looks like you in this town still haven't learned. David's instincts kicked in. Assess threats, count bodies, measure exits. 8 men, all armed, moving with practiced coordination. Through the diner window, he could see Emma reaching for the phone. Last chance, Lockjaw said, circling David's wheelchair. Tell your people to pay. Fall in line. Or we start making examples. Starting with you. David didn't flinch. My father told me something before I shipped out to Nam, he said evenly. There are two kinds of men in this world, those who prey on the weak and those who protect them. His eyes scanned the gang one by one. Looking at you boys, I can tell which kind you are. Lockjaw's face hardened. You calling us cowards, old man? No, David replied calmly. Cowards run. You're worse. You're bullies, and you've mistaken cruelty for strength. The punch hit him hard, square in the chest, knocking the air out of his lungs. Emma burst out the door, but Steve Thompson intercepted her. Let him be, David gasped between shallow breaths. Let everyone see what they are. Lockjaw grabbed the back of the wheelchair, spinning David roughly to face him. You think your medals and war stories mean a damn thing? He barked. This is our town now. Not yet, it isn't, David replied, his tone infuriatingly calm. And your little show right now? It proves exactly why it never will be. A crowd began to form. Neighbors, store owners, onlookers, all kept at bay by armed gang members. Officer McCarthy arrived, his hand on his gun, but even he couldn't step in, not alone. Not against 8 men with weapons and nothing to lose. You're right about one thing, Lockjaw growled. We do need an example. What happened next felt like it unfolded in slow motion. Lockjaw gave the signal. 2 gang members grabbed the wheelchair and dragged David toward the bikes. Then, with practiced efficiency, they began dismantling it, slicing straps, snapping supports, twisting the frame until the metal screamed in protest. No! Emma's voice shattered the air. Dr. Mitchell came running but was blocked by Ramirez. David lay on the ground watching the only thing that gave him independence get torn apart, piece by piece, but he never begged, never cried out. Instead, he began to speak, a quiet chant, each word louder than their violence. Jimmy Martinez, private, killed in Firebase Ripcord, July 23, 1970. Lockjaw leaned in, confused. What's that, old man? David looked up at him. Names, he said. Dates? Young men who thought they were untouchable, thought fear made them strong. And Lockjaw, for the first time, didn't have a comeback. First class, 3rd Marines, David said clearly, his voice cutting through the rising tension. Killed saving his unit from an ambush near Da Nang, 1969. I held him in my arms while he bled out. He looked directly at Lockjaw. He had your eyes. Might have been your uncle. He died protecting people. And here you are, dishonoring everything he gave his life for. The words hit Lockjaw like a physical blow. His sneer faltered. For a moment the mask cracked, and underneath, something flickered. Shame. Or maybe recognition. Beth Armstrong had arrived, silently capturing it all with her phone. This is assault, she said loudly. Destruction of property. A hate crime against a disabled veteran. Add it to the list. Lockjaw tried to recover, flashing a sneer. File all the complaints you want, sweetheart. Won't change a thing. But the confidence in his voice had thinned. Frank Warlock Wilson stood off to the side, visibly disturbed. David caught his eye. Your father served too, didn't he? He asked quietly. Is this what he fought for? Is this what he taught you? Shut your mouth, Lockjaw snapped, kicking the broken frame of David's wheelchair. You don't talk about our families. You don't know anything about us. I know everything, David replied, steady as ever. I've seen your kind before. Men who came home from war carrying darkness, letting it rot them from the inside, thinking fear earns respect. But deep down, you're still just scared boys who saw too much, too young. That one landed hard. Several gang members shifted uneasily, memories they'd buried long ago now clawing their way back. We're done here, Lockjaw barked abruptly. Let him crawl home. Let the town see what happens when they forget who's in charge. As the roar of engines faded, the town began to re-emerge. Officer McCarthy and Dr. Mitchell rushed to David's side, helping him into a temporary wheelchair from the medical center. Emma brought a cold compress for his bruises, tears streaking down her face. I'll drive you home, McCarthy said, voice shaking with restrained fury. But David shook his head. No, take me to the diner. The diner? Mitchell asked, surprised. You need rest, treatment. What I need, David said, eyes locked ahead, is to show them they don't win. They want us hiding, changing our lives out of fear. I didn't let the Viet Cong dictate how I lived. I'm not about to let these cowards do it either. And so, bruised but unbroken, David returned to his usual table. But later, back at his house, alone among the photographs of his service and his son's missions, David finally allowed the cracks to show. His hands trembled as he picked up the secure satellite phone. He'd sworn never to drag his son into this, but watching the town buckle under the iron fist's grip, some promises, he realized, are meant to be broken. When the line connected, his voice carried the weight of everything he hadn't said. "Michael, son, I need you to come home. It's time." Thousands of miles away, somewhere in the Indian Ocean, Navy SEAL Michael Anderson stared at the encrypted phone, his father's voice echoing in his ears. In 15 years of special operations, Michael had dismantled terror cells, disarmed cartels, survived ambushes, but nothing had ever made him feel like this. That voice, calm but breaking underneath, told him everything he needed to know. Bridgewater Falls was under siege, and his father needed him. Back home, the gang wasn't slowing down. They'd gotten bolder. David, now using a loaner wheelchair from the medical center, stuck to his routine, against Emma's protests. Every morning, members of the Iron Fist tailed him, not just to intimidate him, but to make sure the whole town saw him struggling. It was psychological warfare, and it was working. "They're expanding the operation," Beth Armstrong reported during a tense meeting in Emma's back office. "It's not just protection money anymore. They're controlling supply chains, forcing businesses to buy from their approved vendors at outrageous prices." Chief William Donovan rubbed his eyes. "The state police won't get involved without hard evidence of major crimes," he said wearily. "Vandalism and threats won't cut it. We need proof." "What about the beatings?" Dr. Mitchell asked quietly. "I've treated 3 this week. Broken bones. And these weren't bar brawls. These were interrogations, tactical, systematic." David said nothing. He was staring at the map Beth had pinned to the wall, a pattern of incidents, territory claims, and business pressure points. To a trained eye, it wasn't random. It was classic insurgency strategy. "Controlled isolation," he said. "Take over key resources, break morale, keep people afraid and off balance." The bell over the diner's front door chimed. Through the small office window, they watched Frank Warlock Wilson enter. Alone. Again. Emma went to take his order. Her voice was tight, but she remained composed. "He's different," David noted. "Military background, but no combat experience. Support role, maybe." "How can you tell?" Beth asked, discreetly snapping a photo of the young biker. "Posture, behavior. He moves like someone who trained properly, not like the others. They exaggerate, put on a show. He doesn't. He's been trained." Outside, more motorcycles arrived. Thompson, Ramirez, both dismounted. Their vests bore new patches, skulls with numbers. David's face hardened. "Kill markers," he said. "Use them in country. They're not even hiding it anymore." "But we can't prove what they mean," Chief Donovan muttered. A sudden commotion on the street pulled their attention. Through the window, they saw Lockjaw confronting Tom Miller in front of the hardware store. Tom stood his ground. He had refused to switch suppliers, refused to bow to their demands. Dr. Mitchell turned to David. "Your father was right," he said, "about there being 2 kinds of men. The question is, how many in this town are ready to stand up and be counted?" David's phone buzzed. A single text. "Already inbound. Teams in place." Special operations didn't always arrive with lights and sirens. Sometimes they were already there. Emma glanced over, catching a shift in David's expression. "Michael?" she asked softly. David nodded. "He's coming home." There was something flickering in Emma's eyes again. Hope. David allowed himself a small smile. "He's already here." The day carried on, but the air had shifted. Lockjaw's men still roamed the streets, barking orders, flexing power, keeping fear alive through threats and brute force. But beneath the surface, something subtle was unraveling, something they couldn't quite name. Power outages began striking the Iron Fist's temporary HQ. Surveillance cameras they had rigged around town started glitching. Some simply went dark. Delivery trucks they relied on for fuel and equipment, delayed, rerouted, missing. The gang's machine, once tight and precise, was starting to grind. Beth slipped into the booth beside David at Emma's, a folder in hand. "Found these in my office," she said, sliding it toward him. "Took some digging, but most of Lockjaw's core group, former military, special forces, Marines, Army Rangers, all combat trained, all dishonorably discharged." David nodded, flipping through the documents. Lost men, looking for a new command structure. Lockjaw gave them one, twisted it into something dark. Frank Warlock Wilson approached hesitantly, glancing over his shoulder. "Mr. Anderson, about your wheelchair. I didn't know they were going to—" David motioned to the chair across from him. "Sit, son. Tell me about your service." Warlock blinked, stunned. "How'd you— Air Force, right? Technical training. You're not built for this. You don't belong in this mess. You're better than what they're asking you to be." Before Warlock could respond, the door slammed open. Marcus Tempest Williams stormed in. "Boss wants everyone back. Now!" His eyes narrowed at Warlock. "You talking to this old man?" "Just making sure he remembered his place," Warlock stammered before retreating. Later that night, Chief Donovan arrived at David's house. His face was grim. "Got word from the state police," he said. "Iron Fist is using Bridgewater Falls to move weapons, drugs, possibly human trafficking. We're not just victims anymore, David. We're the distribution hub." Beth's expression darkened. "They need total control of this town. That's why they're pushing harder. And if we don't stop them soon, we're complicit." David stood by the window, watching the last light disappear beyond the rooftops. "They're pulling their men off the streets," he observed. "Not fewer bikers, just less visible. They're prepping for something." His phone buzzed. Another secure message from Michael. "Recon complete. Assets in place. Phase 1 begins at dawn." Dr. Mitchell, reading over his shoulder, let out a slow, grim breath. They thought they were hunting this town. Didn't realize they were the ones being hunted. Outside, the usual evening patrol passed by. Tough looks, loud engines, and quiet menace. But David saw through it. Warlock kept glancing over his shoulder. Even the veterans among them looked different now, on edge, uncertain. They had come into Bridgewater Falls like wolves. But tomorrow, they'd learn what it meant to be prey. As night fell, new shadows moved through the town, silent, surgical, unseen. Not the gang's men. These moved differently, like ghosts. The Iron Fist gang had brought war to a quiet American town. Now one of the country's most elite warriors was bringing something they didn't understand. Hope. The first crack in their armor came with a missing truck. Their weekly supply run, vital to their operation, simply never showed. Lockjaw's fury echoed down Main Street as he grilled his lieutenants. No one could explain it, no signs of theft. Just gone. David, back at his usual spot in Emma's, watched the unfolding chaos with practiced calm. "They're off balance," he murmured. "Routine's broken. They're reacting instead of controlling." Beth slid into the booth. "3 of their bikes wouldn't start this morning," she whispered. "Someone drained the tanks. No damage. Just empty." "Professional," David said. They turned their eyes to the window where Frank Warlock Wilson was crouched next to his own bike, inspecting it with military precision, but his hands were shaking. "Fear's setting in," Chief Donovan said, arriving with his coffee. "State police found surveillance photos of Bridgewater Falls scattered across 3 counties. Every file, every plan, gone. No prints, no digital trace. Just vanished." David sipped his tea. "I wouldn't know anything about that," he said with a faint smile. "Though I did hear a few of their vendors are suddenly receiving anonymous tips. Seems word's gotten out about possible federal investigations." Maria burst through the back entrance, still in her nursing scrubs. "Mr. Anderson," she said breathlessly, "the medical center's getting strange calls." "All our supply shipments are being rerouted for inspection." The gang's people can't figure out who authorized it. The morning rolled on, and the signs of silent resistance kept piling up. Iron Fist's encrypted comms began to fail. Random signals bled into their frequencies. Fragments of military code, nonsense transmissions, numbers that made no sense. They couldn't coordinate, couldn't communicate. They were cut off, and they didn't even know yet that this was just the beginning. Bridgewater Falls, a town that fought back. When a violent gang of disgraced veterans called the Iron Fist took over Bridgewater Falls, they underestimated the strength of a wheelchair-bound veteran named David Anderson. After his wheelchair was destroyed in public, David reached out to his son Michael, a Navy SEAL. What followed wasn't revenge, but something far more powerful, a strategic, silent dismantling of the gang from within. Michael and his elite team used military precision to sabotage the gang's infrastructure, sever supply lines, disable surveillance, and disrupt communications, all without being seen. Gang members began to fracture under pressure. Veterans within the gang, like Frank Warlock Wilson, started to question their loyalty, ultimately turning against their leaders. The Iron Fist's grip on the town weakened as the townspeople, once paralyzed by fear, grew bolder. More ex-gang members joined the resistance. David's Diner became a command center, and Bridgewater Falls, once a target, became the birthplace of a new movement, redemption through service. When the cartel behind Iron Fist retaliated, first with bureaucratic pressure, then with armed mercenaries, the reformed veterans stood their ground. They didn't just defend the town, they protected its soul. Every attack failed. The cartel's best-trained operatives were outmaneuvered by men who had once been lost, but now had something real to fight for. Eventually, the cartels fell. Reformed veterans exposed corruption, turned over evidence, and helped federal agencies dismantle the broader criminal network. Other towns took notice. Bridgewater Falls became a national model. Its rehabilitation program replicated across the country. In the end, the gang that tried to break a veteran's spirit ended up setting a movement free. David's wheelchair was rebuilt, not as a symbol of loss, but of transformation. The town had not only survived, it had been reborn through unity, purpose, and the belief that redemption is always possible.